the beginning a monastery cursed by time. They say there are places in this world where the veil between the living and the dead is thin, so thin that if you stand quietly and listen long enough, you can hear whispers from the other side. One of those places is in the English countryside, where the winds always seem a bit colder, the nights darker and silence heavier. Before it was ever known as Borley Rectory, the land was home to a Benedictine monastery, a sacred place built in the 13th century, now long vanished, but never truly gone. Local legends say it was never an ordinary monastery. It was whispered that the monks here practiced strange rituals, not just prayers and psalms, but something else, something forbidden. For generations, the villagers surrounding the property refused to walk near the grounds after sunset. Children were warned never to play near the hedgerows that lined the old boundary stones. Shepherds, strong and skeptical, would hurry their flocks past the overgrown ruins before dusk fell. And then there was the story of the bell that rang by itself. It began one night in the early 1500s, long after the monastery had been abandoned. Villagers reported hearing the ancient bell, long rusted and broken, tolling at midnight. Just once. No wind, no footsteps, no visible presence. Yet the sound echoed through the air like a warning. From that night on, every month, always on the last night, the bell would ring again. As decades passed, the land became known only as the cursed ground. Nothing grew well there. Crops withered. Livestock grew ill. Even birds avoided flying over it. Some believed it was merely bad soil or coincidence. Others, however, were convinced something dark still lingered. And then, the stories of the nun began. No one knew her name. All they had was the image passed down through whispers of a woman dressed in black, face veiled, walking silently across the grounds with her hands clasped in prayer. She never looked up, never acknowledged anyone. Some said she appeared only on misty nights. Others claimed they saw her during broad daylight, but every sighting ended the same way. She would vanish into thin air before reaching the edge of the ruined chapel wall. An old woman from the nearby village once claimed the nun had tried to speak to her. In a voice like the rustling of dry leaves, the spirit whispered, "Buried, but not forgiven." It sent chills through every spine that heard it. Eventually, the monastery's true story began to emerge from beneath the dust of history. Through half-burnt records and long-forgotten diaries, a tale was uncovered, one that made even the bravest fall silent. In the mid-14th century, one of the monks, Father Henry Dawson, had broken the sacred vow of celibacy. He had fallen in love with a young woman, a nun from another convent, whose name was erased from all records as punishment. Their secret meetings became frequent, hidden behind chapel walls and ancient corridors. But nothing stays hidden forever. When the affair was discovered, the punishment was swift and cruel. Father Henry was dragged from the monastery, stripped of his robes, and executed in a nearby forest under the order of the church. As for the nun, she suffered an even worse fate. According to legend, she was bricked alive into the very walls of the monastery as penance for her sin. The screams, they say, lasted for hours. From that moment, the monastery was never the same. Illness spread among the monks. One by one, they died, some from fever, others from madness. One monk reportedly gouged out his own eyes, muttering about eyes watching from the walls. Another was found floating in the river with a cross nailed into his chest. By the late 1500s, the monastery was abandoned. Nature began reclaiming it, but no trees ever grew where the nun had been buried. That patch of earth remained dead, no matter how many times someone tried to till it or plant over it. Just dead earth like a wound on the land that refused to heal. Generations passed. The monastery faded from maps, but not from memory. And then came the Waldegrave family. Wealthy, curious, and eager to build a summer residence, they purchased the land in the 1800s. The villagers warned them, pleaded, even but money has a way of silencing old fears. The family laughed off the legends and began construction. Stone by stone, brick by brick, the new house rose. They named it Borley Rectory, after the nearby parish. It was tall, elegant, surrounded by gardens. But something was wrong from the very beginning. Workmen quit suddenly. Tools vanished. Shadows moved on their own. One man swore he saw a woman in black watching him from an upper window, only to discover that part of the house hadn't even been completed yet. Another worker left screaming after finding Latin phrases carved into newly laid floorboards, phrases no one had put there. But the walled graves pressed on. They moved in during spring. By autumn, they stopped hosting guests. By winter, the family rarely left their rooms. What happened inside that house remains partly a mystery, but diaries found later revealed fragments. The chapel bell rang again last night, but it is broken. Elizabeth says she saw a nun in the hallway. She was crying. The walls whisper at night. I swear I hear scratching behind the bedroom plaster. And then silence. One by one, the entries stopped. Eventually, the house was left empty. A beautiful home on cursed ground waiting. But it wouldn't stay silent for long. In 1863, a traveler named Thomas Everill attempted to stay the night at Borley Rectory. He was a skeptic, mocking the idea of ghosts. He brought candles, ink, and a journal, determined to spend the night alone and disprove the legends. His journal was later found on the second floor. The final page simply read, "She knocked once, then again. She will not stop knocking." Thomas was never seen again. The story of Borley began not with fire or murder, or even a haunting, but with a love that defied sacred rules, punished by men who believed they were doing God's work. And now, centuries later, the dead still walk beneath the foundation of a house that should never have been built. Some say the nun still prays for forgiveness. Others say she's searching for Father Henry, still trapped in eternal damnation. Whatever the truth is, one thing is certain. Borley Rectory was not just haunted. It was claimed. 3 centuries of darkness, the Waldegrave legacy. If the cursed ground of Borley was the stage, then the Waldegrave family was its tragic cast, drawn to a land that whispered promises, but only delivered suffering. The Waldegraves were a noble English family, wealthy and ambitious, tracing their bloodline back to the 16th century, known for their political influence and strong ties to the church. They were also whispered to be deeply superstitious. Some believed their wealth was built not just on land and labor, but on secrets, ancient ones. In the late 1600s, Sir Thomas Waldegrave, a cold and determined man, purchased the former monastery land at Borley. At the time, the monastery had long been in ruins, overrun with moss and half swallowed by the earth. Locals avoided the area. Strange tales had already begun to circulate about the nun, the bell, and shadows moving without light. But Sir Thomas ignored the warnings. He saw the land not as cursed, but as untapped potential. What better way to assert his family's power than by conquering even the most feared ground? He ordered the remains of the monastery to be torn down, brick by brick. Some said the workers found bones beneath the altar, human bones, still wrapped in decayed cloth. The findings were quietly buried again, and no official record was kept. A chapel was built in their place, then stables, then gardens. The new Waldegrave estate began to take shape, but with it came the curse. The first tragedy struck just a year later. Sir Thomas's only son, Edward, drowned in the estate's ornamental pond. He was 12 years old. No one saw what happened, But when they pulled his body from the water, his hands were clasped in prayer the same way the ghostly nun had often been described. The family was shaken, but refused to leave. Sir Thomas said it was a test of faith. Over the next decades, the estate grew, but so did the darkness. Each generation of the Waldegraves experienced strange losses, violent deaths, or unexplained madness. It was as though the land itself rejected them, as if it refused to forget the sins buried beneath it. In the 1720s, Lady Eleanor Waldegrave, wife of the current lord, began reporting strange dreams. She claimed a woman in black visited her bedside every night, whispering unintelligible words and pointing toward the walls. At first, the family dismissed it as the imagination of a grieving woman. She had just lost her newborn daughter, after all. But then, other servants began reporting the same thing. A woman in black drifting through the hallways, always silent, always watching. Mirrors began to fog from the inside. The family dog refused to enter the east wing. One night, during a dinner party, the main chandelier suddenly crashed down, narrowly missing the guests. In the confusion, a clergyman, looked up and swore he saw a veiled woman standing on the balcony. But no one was there. Letters from that time reveal the terror inside the house. It is no longer just grief. I see her even when I am awake. I hear prayers in Latin, but no one speaks them aloud. I fear what we've brought upon this place. Letter from Lady Eleanor, dated 1726. The family's reputation began to suffer. Neighbors whispered about dark practices. Some believed the Waldegraves had disturbed something holy. Others thought they were paying for the sins of an ancestor, possibly Father Henry, though his name was never spoken aloud. By the 1800s, the estate had become a place of isolation. Few visited. Many believed the family was cursed, and those who married into it rarely stayed long. One bride reportedly fled just weeks after her wedding night, claiming she was followed by footsteps, even when alone. Yet the Waldegraves clung to their land, stubborn and proud. In 1853, Lord Francis Waldegrave made the fateful decision to expand. He planned to build a new manor on the old ruins, a structure larger, grander, one that would erase the past once and for all. And thus, the foundations of what would later be known as Borley Rectory were laid. But as soon as construction began, the land rebelled. Stone walls cracked for no reason. Tools went missing, only to be found buried deep in the earth. One mason claimed he saw a face behind the wall, eyes open, mouth silently screaming. He never returned to the site. The new house was finished in 1862. It was magnificent, a red brick marvel with tall windows and sprawling corridors. But it was never a home. Even during the day, it was cold. The fireplaces struggled to stay lit. The wind howled louder here than anywhere else nearby. And at night, the house moved, wood creaked without weight. Doors opened themselves. A low humming sound like chanting echoed through the hallways. Lord Francis tried to keep the truth quiet, but servants began to vanish. One girl, only 17, left a note saying, "I cannot sleep with her watching me." She was never seen again. Worse still, the Waldegrave bloodline began to wither. Miscarriages became common. Illness took children before they reached their teens. Madness gripped even the strongest minds. One journal, written by a nurse in 1887, described an incident involving the youngest son of the family. He kept speaking to someone who wasn't there. He called her Mother Grace, but there was no Grace in the household. He said she stood in the garden, waiting. When I asked him what she looked like, he said, "She doesn't have a face anymore." By the late 1800s, the Waldegraves had become a shadow of what they once were. The estate was falling apart, and the family was plagued by debt and death. Some whispered that the last heir, Charles Waldegrave, was trying to sell the property not for money, but out of fear. In 1892, Charles vanished. His study was found in perfect condition, ink still wet, candle burning, but he was gone. No signs of struggle, no footprints. Just an open door leading to the cellar and cold air rising from below. The official story claimed he left for Europe, but locals believed otherwise. They said the house had taken him. With no heir left, Borley Rectory sat in silence for years waiting. But the story didn't end there. It's said that during these years, villagers occasionally saw lights inside the windows. Some claimed they heard organ music drifting through the air, though the house had no organ. And always the figure of the veiled woman gliding past the upstairs windows, stopping just long enough to be seen, then gone. By the time the Foister family acquired Borley in the 1920s, the Waldegrave name had all but disappeared from history. But the pain they brought and left behind remained. To this day, people claim the land still remembers the Waldegraves. Visitors speak of sudden nausea, dizziness, or overwhelming sorrow when walking the grounds. A few have even heard voices whispering in Latin, praying, begging, weeping. It is as though the ghosts of the Waldegraves are still there, trapped in a cycle of guilt, regret, and unending darkness. 3 centuries of sorrow, 3 centuries of silence and screams, 3 centuries of a curse that refused to die. A house built on sin awakening the sleeping curse. It is often said that when the past is buried, it should be left alone. But some people dig anyway, out of pride, out of ignorance, or out of the dangerous belief that the dead no longer care. In the case of Borley, that mistake belonged to Reverend Henry Dawson Ellis Bull, a descendant of the Waldegrave bloodline. In the late 1800s, Henry Bull inherited what remained of the Borley estate. The land was overgrown, the manor in ruin, and the legacy of terror long silenced beneath layers of time and denial. But Henry was not a man who believed in ghosts. He was ambitious, deeply religious, and convinced that with prayer and progress, even the darkest history could be rewritten. And so, in 1862, he began construction on a brand new rectory, directly on top of the ruined monastery with its ceremony, without respect, and most dangerously, without permission from the past. The foundation was poured with the bones of monks still beneath the soil. The cellar was built over what had once been the sacred burial chamber. No blessing was offered. No ritual of peace was made. It was brick and mortar laid atop desecration. And something noticed. Locals immediately raised concerns. They warned him that the land was cursed, that no building would stand long without consequence. But Reverend Bull dismissed them. He called the stories village superstition and the sightings tricks of the mist. He even mocked the legends during sermons. His arrogance would be his undoing. The house, when completed, was large, over 20 rooms, with long hallways, narrow staircases, and deep, echoing cellars. It stood proud among the trees, its red brick exterior catching the sunlight like a jewel. But no warmth ever stayed inside. Even on the brightest days, the house felt cold. The walls seemed to breathe with a faint pulse. Mirrors tarnished quickly. Candles flickered in rooms with no draft. But still, Reverend Bull and his family moved in. Almost immediately, the phenomena began. The very first night, his youngest daughter, Ethel, woke screaming. She claimed a woman in black had been standing by her bed, holding a crucifix upside down. Her brother, Harry, laughed at a until he, too, was awoken days later by the sound of weeping beneath the floorboards. The family tried to ignore it. They even joked about it, calling their home the most spiritual place in Essex. But as time passed, The jokes wore thin. Footsteps echoed through the halls when no one was there. Doors locked on their own. Servants quit without notice, many refusing to explain why. One maid was found unconscious in the pantry, her arms covered in scratches shaped like letters, though they spelled nothing. And then came the nun. She was first spotted by a gardener in the orchard, drifting silently between trees, her face obscured by a black veil. He thought she was one of the children playing a prank until she floated above the ground and passed through a tree. Other sightings soon followed. She appeared by the chapel wall, always at twilight. She walked along the garden path, only to vanish before reaching the door. Sometimes she stood at the top of the staircase, staring downward into the dark. She never made a sound, and wherever she was seen, cold followed. But it wasn't just her. Other shadows came too. A headless man, walking the hallway, a carriage that arrived with no driver, a faceless figure staring out from the attic window. The spirits were gathering, drawn by the house, awakened by its presence, and no longer willing to stay silent. Reverend Bull, however, refused to leave. He claimed that he could pray the evil away. He began holding private ceremonies, burning incense, speaking in Latin old, forgotten words not found in any modern scripture. Some said he'd become obsessed. Others whispered that he was trying to communicate with something. One journal, written by a former housemaid, offers chilling insight. The Reverend spends hours in the cellar now. He says he's trying to uncover the truth. I've heard him talking down there, Alan, but there are voices answering back. Then, in 1892, Reverend Bull died suddenly sitting in his study chair, a look of frozen terror on his face. His death was ruled natural, but his eyes were wide open, and his lips were bluey as if something had stolen the breath from his lungs. After his death, the house stood quiet for a time. His sons inherited the property, but none dared live in it. It remained empty for years, decaying slowly, as vines crept up its walls and fog curled around its gates like fingers. But legends never die, and soon, the house began to attract attention from the outside world. Paranormal investigators, thrill seekers, and skeptics all came to Borley Rectory. Most left shaken. A few never spoke of their visits again. One traveler, a professor from Cambridge, stayed overnight in 1901. He kept a journal. His final entry read, "The nun is real. I saw her in the chapel at midnight. She turned to me, but had no eyes, just darkness where her face should be. I heard chantingman's voice coming from the ground beneath me. I must leave at first light." He never did. His body was found in the morning, slumped at the dining table, both ears bleeding. The coroner claimed it was a cerebral hemorrhage, but some whispered he'd been forced to hear something no human should. Years passed, and still, the house stood a monument to hubris, built on sanctified ground, and soaked in sorrow. Locals began referring to it as the house that should never have been. Even the church distanced itself from the location, and yet it remained. Every now and then, someone brave or foolish would try to live there, but the house didn't want them. Doors would slam, objects would vanish, clocks would stop, children would speak in voices that weren't their own, and always, the nun would appear walking, waiting, weeping. In 1928, a new chapter of horror would begin, with the arrival of the Foister family. But that is a story for another time. What Reverend Bull did was not just a mistake, it was a violation. He disturbed the bones of the damned. He built a sanctuary not for the living but for the trapped and the vengeful. In trying to cleanse the land, he only opened it wider, like a wound left exposed to rot. And the land remembered. It still does, even now, long after the house has burned. People say you can hear the bell tolling on stormy nights. They say the nun still walks, searching for peace she'll never find. And beneath the soil, something still waits lit, watching, and very, very patient. The phantom nun and the invisible carriage. In the quiet village near Borley, tales have been whispered for centuries. Tales of shadows and spirits, of sorrow and wrath, stories passed from generation to generation, each one more chilling than the last. Among them, one legend stands out, spoken of in hushed tones by those brave enough to remember, the story of the phantom nun and her invisible carriage. The villagers claim that on certain nights, when the moon is full and the mist curls low over the fields, a strange sight appears along the old dirt road leading to Borley Rectory. It begins with a faint glimmer, soft as candlelight glowing just beyond the edge of the trees. Then comes a slow, rhythmic sound, hoofbeats that echo eerily through the night. But without any horse visible, a carriage rolls forward silently, its wheels barely disturbing the gravel, and beside it walks the nun, dressed in a black habit, her face veiled and pale. She moves with a grace that seems both ethereal and sorrowful. Sometimes she gazes ahead, other times she looks back, as if searching for something or someone. The carriage itself is an enigma. No driver, no horses, just an empty vehicle rolling as if pushed by an unseen force. Some say it floats slightly above the ground. Others say the wheels don't turn, but the sound of their movement is there anyway. Witnesses have described seeing the nun raise a hand, beckoning or warning before vanishing along with the carriage into the thick fog. The first recorded sighting goes back to the late 1800s, during the Waldegrave era. A farmer named John Hill was walking home late after tending his sheep, when he saw the strange procession. Frozen with fear, he watched as the nun passed silently, her lips moving in a prayer no one else could hear. He later claimed that the next morning, one of his lambs was found dead, its body cold and lifeless as if drained of all warmth. This story spread quickly, terrifying locals. More sightings followed, each one eerier than the last. A young maid employed at Borley Rectory told of waking up in the dead of night to see the nun standing at the foot of her bed, holding a small crucifix that glowed faintly. The maid fainted and awoke hours later, the room cold and silent. Another witness was a traveling merchant who camped near the old road. He recounted hearing carriage wheels rolling nearby but saw no vehicle. Suddenly, a figure in black appeared by the firelight and whispered a warning about unfinished sins. Before disappearing into the night, some villagers believe the nun is the restless spirit of the woman punished for her forbidden love, the same one who was bricked alive into the monastery walls centuries ago. Her sorrow and rage bound her to the land, forever trapped in a cycle of anguish. The carriage, they say, is the means by which she travels, perhaps searching for her lost love. Father Henry Dawson Ellis Bull, or maybe carrying souls to a judgment they will never escape. Psychics who have visited Borley describe overwhelming feelings of despair and cold, as if the air itself was thick with sorrow. Some claim to hear the distant clip-clop of the carriage wheels even when no one else does. On moonlit nights, the village dogs howl incessantly, and the wind seems to carry faint prayers in Latin, drifting from the direction of the rectory ruins. But it is not only fear that the nun's apparition inspires. Some villagers say she is also a warning, a reminder of the terrible price of breaking sacred vows and disturbing the dead. One elder once told a visiting historian, "She's not just lost, she's angry, and she's waiting for the day the curse is lifted or the wrongdoers come to pay." The legend grew so strong that even passing travelers would avoid the road during full moons. afraid of encountering the carriage and the nun who rode with it. In the early 20th century, several visitors reported attempts to communicate with the apparition. A medium named Florence Mason claimed she had a seance in the ruins near the old monastery site. She said the spirit of the nun spoke through her. "The chains bind me, the silence kills me, until I find peace, I walk." Florence collapsed shortly after and was haunted by nightmares for months. The story of the phantom nun and the invisible carriage became one of the most enduring and chilling parts of Borley's dark history. Even today, those who live near the site say that on certain nights, if you stand quietly and look toward the trees, you might just see a flicker of black and hear the ghostly wheels turning, carrying a soul that can never rest. The curse of Father Henry, forbidden love and tragic death. The story of Borley Rectory would not be complete without the tragic tale of Father Henry Dawson Ellis Bull, the man whose forbidden love and brutal punishment gave birth to a curse that would haunt the land for centuries. Born in the late 16th century, Henry was a respected priest and scholar. His devotion to God was unwavering, and he was known among his peers for his strict discipline and solemn demeanor. Yet beneath this austere exterior beat the heart of a man torn between duty and desire. In the shadowed halls of a nearby convent lived Sister Agnes, a young nun whose beauty was as captivating as her piety was sincere. Henry met her during a rare visit, and, despite the walls of faith and obedience that separated them, an undeniable bond grew. Their love was whispered only in stolen glances and secret letters, hidden beneath altar stones and in the folds of sacred robes. They knew their union was forbidden, a sin punishable by death, yet the heart defies reason, and theirs beat in a desperate rhythm. But fate was merciless. Word of their affair spread like wildfire. Some say it was a jealous rival. Others claim the church's strict hierarchy kept a watchful eye. Whatever the truth, the lovers were caught. The punishment was swift and cruel. Father Henry was dragged before a tribunal, stripped of his titles, and condemned to death by hanging. Sister Agnes was sentenced to be walled alive within the convent's oldest chapel of fate, both tortuous and eternal. As the executioner's noose tightened around Henry's neck, legend says he cursed the very ground beneath them. "May those who judge us be forever haunted by the sorrow they sow. May their bloodline know grief, and their souls never find rest." The words, spoken with his last breath, seemed to echo through the centuries. After their deaths, the monastery where the tragic events unfolded was abandoned. But the sorrow did not fade, it grew, darkening the land and poisoning the hearts of those who dared live there. Local villagers claim that on certain nights, they can still hear the anguished cries of Sister Agnes, trapped within stone walls, her voice carrying on the wind like a mournful hymn. Father Henry's spirit, too, is said to roam Borley Rectory. His figure sometimes glimpsed near the chapel ruins, clad in gray robes, eyes hollow with regret. Many who have encountered him describe a cold presence, a sorrow that seeps into the bones. Some say his apparition is a warning, a reminder of the consequences of forbidden love and betrayal. Throughout the centuries, the curse seemed to manifest in tragic ways: sudden deaths, unexplained illnesses, madness among the Waldegrave family, and a string of mysterious disappearances connected to the estate. The story of Father Henry and Sister Agnes is more than a tale of love and punishment. It is the heart of the Borley hauntings, the reason the land is restless, and the spirits are trapped. Paranormal investigators who visited Borley have reported hearing voices pleading for forgiveness, cold spots near the chapel, and even objects moving on their own. Some believe that the curse will only be lifted when their souls are reunited or forgiven of fate, yet to be fulfilled. The tale serves as a chilling lesson. Some loves are forbidden for a reason, and some sins cast shadows that last beyond death. The curse of Father Henry, forbidden love, and a tragic death. The story of Father Henry is one that the villagers dare not speak out loud after sundown. Long ago, nestled between the misty cliffs of Northern Ireland, there stood a small stone church. Ancient and cold, its roof forever dripping with the moisture of the ever-present fog. The church, built in the 12th century, was said to be blessed by saints and yet cursed by sinners. It was within these walls that Father Henry served. Young, pious, and deeply respected, Henry was sent to the parish after completing his studies in Rome. His sermons were powerful, filled with fire and devotion. The villagers loved him. They said he had eyes that saw into your soul, but never judged. But beneath his holy robes, Father Henry carried a secret that would not only destroy him, but leave behind one of the darkest hauntings the church had ever known. Her name was Sister Mary. She was just 19 when she joined the convent next to the church, orphaned during the famine. Mary had been taken in by the nuns. She was gentle, beautiful in a quiet, ethereal way. And she sang. Lord, how she sang, every evening at Vespers, as her voice floated through the stone halls. Father Henry found himself lingering near the chapel doors, pretending to check on candles or the altar. But in truth, he was listening, drawn, addicted. Their first conversation happened by accident. Mary had dropped a book of Psalms in the garden, and he helped her pick it up. Their hands touched, their eyes met, and something inside both of them changed. At first, it was innocent, scripture readings, shared prayers. But soon, those moments turned into stolen glances, then into midnight walks through the cloisters, and finally into secret rendezvous behind the statue of St. Peter, where no one would hear their whispers. They knew it was wrong. They knew the church forbade it. But love doesn't obey doctrine. It blooms in silence. It consumes. For months, they hid their affair, until the night it all unraveled. It was storming. Thunder crashed outside, and lightning briefly lit the stained glass like ghostly fire. That night, Father Henry had crept into the chapel, where Mary waited. But someone had followed him. Sister Agnes. Agnes was old, stern, and utterly devoted to the rules. She had long suspected something unholy between the two. That night, she saw enough. Enough to report them. Enough to damn them. The very next morning, Henry was stripped of his title. The bishop declared his love a sin soaked in evil. Mary was locked in a cold cell beneath the convent, and within days, she fell ill. They said it was fever. Others whispered she had refused food, refused water, and died crying for Henry. She was buried in an unmarked grave behind the church. No ceremony, no mourning, just dirt and stone. As for Father Henry, his punishment was worse. The church refused to let him leave. You will stay here and atone, the bishop commanded. You will live among the whispers of your sin. And so he did, for years. Each night, he prayed in the chapel where he had once held Mary. Each day, he wandered the graveyard, searching the unnamed stones, wondering where she lay. He grew thin, pale. His voice, once so powerful, became a hoarse whisper. He barely spoke. Then one morning, the villagers found him. His body was discovered at the altar, sprawled beneath the crucifix, blood trickling from his mouth. In his hand was a withered red rose, pressed between the pages of the Song of Solomon. No autopsy was ever performed. The bishop ordered a quiet burial and warned the villagers to forget, but they never could, because that's when the hauntings began. It started with the choir, young girls practicing alone in the chapel, would hear someone humming behind them. Always the same melody, soft, mournful, like a lullaby. When they turned around, no one was there. Then came the sightings. Villagers walking by at night claimed they saw two figures standing at the altar, a priest and a nun, hand in hand. But when they entered the church, it was empty. The most chilling tale came from the new father assigned to replace Henry. Father Donnelly had only been at the parish a week when he was awakened at 2 a.m. by the church bells ringing. Startled, he rushed outside. There was no wind, no storm, nothing that could have triggered them. But the bells rang loud and clear, a mournful toll. 12 times. He entered the chapel, heart pounding. There, kneeling at the altar, was a figure in black robes. At first, Donnelly thought it was another priest, but as he stepped closer, the figure turned and its face was hollow. Black eyes, no mouth, just the soft sound of weeping echoing from within its chest. Donnelly fled the church. He never returned. Today, the church is abandoned. Locals refuse to go near it, especially in spring season when Mary died. But the brave few who dare enter speak of the same things. The scent of roses lingering in the air, candles lighting themselves, and soft whispers in Latin echoing down the stone corridors. Some say that Father Henry's spirit still wanders, bound by guilt and sorrow. Others believe the curse is worse, that any man who enters the chapel with impure thoughts will face the same punishment. One story never officially recorded, but whispered in fear tells of a young seminarian who visited the church in 1992. He had heard the legend and thought it was nonsense. As a joke, he kissed his girlfriend on the altar, laughing as he did. The next morning, his body was found twisted at the foot of the cross. His eyes were wide open, mouth agape in a silent scream. No marks, no wounds. But his girlfriend, she was never seen again. Local lore says the curse of Father Henry will never be lifted. Not until his soul finds peace. Not until the church acknowledges what it did to him and Mary. But that may never happen, because behind the official history of holy men and saints lies a truth far darker. That love, when chained by dogma, can rot into something cursed, something eternal. And so the church remains silent, forgotten, and forever watching. But on certain nights, especially when the moon is full, if you walk past the old chapel and listen closely, you may hear it. A hymn, two voices, singing as one. One deep, sorrowful and hoarse. The other soft, sweet, and broken. Father Henry and Sister Mary, together, forever, in a love that defied heaven and was damned to never rest. Mrs. Foister locked in the room, a house with a mind of its own. In the quiet countryside of Essex, England, stands a peculiar house. Its walls whisper secrets. Its halls breathe with unseen presence, and its past is a tapestry of sorrow, whispers, and things that refuse to stay buried. Known as Borley Rectory, it was once dubbed the most haunted house in England. But one of its darkest chapters unfolded during the years Reverend Lionel Foister and his wife, Mary Ann, took residence there. This part of the story is not told through books or historical documents, but through the trembling voice of a woman who claimed the house was Olivia and it knew her name. The arrival of the Foisters. In 1930, Reverend Lionel Foister was appointed to take over the church duties in the small parish of Borley. He moved into the rectory with his much younger wife, Mary Ann Foister. Locals, already wary of the building's haunted reputation, warned them so gently. Others with outright fear. They say the rectory never rests, said one elderly parishioner. It waits and watches. At first, the Foisters dismissed the superstitions as harmless village gossip, but it didn't take long for the rectory to make its presence known. Strange beginnings. Only weeks after they moved in, Marianne began noticing small disturbances. Cold spots would appear suddenly, regardless of weather. Objects went missing only to reappear in places she'd already searched. Doors creaked open by themselves. At night, she'd hear footsteps pacing in the upstairs hallway, except no one was ever there. But the most disturbing event happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I had just gone to lie down in the bedroom after tea. Marianne later wrote in her diary, "When the door slammed shut on its own, I thought it was the wind tunnel. I heard the lock turn. Locked from the outside. Panic set in. She rushed to the door and jiggled the handle, banging and shouting. But Lionel was in the garden, far from earshot. When he returned, he found the door unlocked. To his horror, Marianne was curled up in the corner of the room, pale and trembling. I swear it locked itself," she whispered. "And it wasn't just the door. Something was in there with me." Whispers in the dark. Over the following months, the activity intensified. Marianne frequently awoke to the feeling of being watched. The bed sheets would be ripped off in the middle of the night. On one occasion, she was thrown out of the bed entirely as though invisible hands had pushed her. Lionel was skeptical at first, but when he witnessed furniture moving on its own, and when disembodied voices began to call Marianne's name from the empty hallways, he had no choice but to accept what they were facing. The rectory wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. It was intelligent. It reacted to their emotions. It anticipated their movements. It wanted something. The Diary of Despair. Marianne began keeping detailed notes of her experiences, hoping that by documenting them, she might gain some control. Her diary entries paint a terrifying picture. September 17th. The bathroom door closed itself while I was inside. No wind. No draft. Just me and something else. October 2nd. I saw writing on the wall today, scratched into the plaster. Right above the stairs, "Marianne must go." Lionel painted over it. The words came back. October 15th. Locked in again. I heard breathing deep, slow, right behind me. But I was alone. I screamed until Lionel broke down the door. The most chilling entry came on All Hallows Eve. October 31st. A voice whispered in my ear while I was brushing my hair. It said, "The house remembers. The house chooses." I don't think it's a ghost. I think the house is alive. An entity or a mind? Many paranormal investigators and skeptics have studied Borley Rectory. But what set the Foister haunting apart was not the frequency of activity, but the intelligence behind it. Unlike residual hauntings where ghosts repeat actions like broken records, what happened to the Foisters was responsive. The more fearful Marianne became, the more aggressive the disturbances. It was as if the house fed on fear. Notes appeared on the mirrors in the bathroom, asking for help. Once, the phrase "like the way" appeared in the steam after a bath. They tried to perform a blessing on the house only to find the altar desecrated the next morning, with a dead bird laid carefully on the prayer book. Or what was behind this? Possession of space. One theory was that the house itself had become a spiritual battery. Decades of death, sorrow, and forbidden secrets had soaked into its foundation. The walls absorbed it, the floors remembered it, and the structure evolved, gaining something akin to consciousness. This wasn't a ghost with unfinished business. This was a structure that had learned to feel. A chilling idea emerged. Perhaps Borley Rectory was no longer a place but an entity. A haunting with rules. The Foisters began noticing patterns. The house seemed to have rules. If Marianne was alone, it would act up. If she was frightened, it would isolate her. If Lionel was near, things went quiet, but only for a while. Even worse, the house seemed to want Lionel to turn on his wife. Once, a handwritten note appeared on his desk. "She lies. She cheats. Cast her out." The handwriting didn't match either of theirs. Lionel confronted Mary Ann, who was shocked and horrified. There had been no deceit, at least. Not that she admitted. But the damage was done. Distrust festered between them. Was the house trying to drive them apart? The final breaking point. The final straw came on a stormy winter night. Marian had been reading alone in the drawing room when the lights went out. She rose to check the fuse box, but the moment she stepped into the hallway, she was thrown against the wall, hard. She said later that it felt like hands cold and strong had gripped her shoulders. Her head hit the floor. As she tried to crawl away, she saw the writing again, this time smeared in something red on the floorboards. "You are not welcome." Lionel found her half-conscious at the foot of the stairs. That night, they fled the rectory and never returned to sleep another night there. Aftermath and legacy. The Foister case was well documented, and many paranormal researchers, including famed investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren, later cited it as one of the few examples of a sentient haunting a location where the house or building appears to develop a personality. Was the house truly alive, or had trauma, fear, and superstition shaped perception to the point of creating an illusion of intelligence? Whatever the explanation, one thing is certain: the Foisters never fully recovered from their time inside that house. Marianne refused to speak about it publicly in her later years. When pressed, she would only say, "The house, it didn't just haunt us, it knew us, and it wanted me gone." To this day, though the original structure of Borley Rectory has since been destroyed by fire, locals report strange lights over the ruins, whispers from the trees, and cold gusts that appear from nowhere. Some say the house is dead. Others believe it's only sleeping, waiting for someone new to wake it up. And if it truly had a mind of its own, then it remembers everything. The bloody writings on the wall and the floating stones. There are places in this world where the air itself seems to whisper secrets, where the walls remember things that no one should, and where even the silence feels watched. Borley Rectory was one of those places. Following the terrifying events involving Mrs. Foister being locked inside her own bedroom by invisible forces and violently thrown from her bedhouse, had fallen under even deeper suspicion. Whispers grew louder. Locals no longer crossed the path near the rectory after sunset. Children were warned to stay away, and the vicarage that once stood as a house of God now seemed to pulse with something dark, something alive. But no one was prepared for what came next. It started with a single word, scrawled in what looked like blood, arc, dried, and crusted across the upstairs hallway wall. Marianne. The name was written jaggedly, as if by a trembling or unskilled hand, or one not entirely human. Marianne Foister, the lady of the house, had found it early one morning while retrieving laundry. At first, she thought it was a cruel prank played by the locals, but the blood-red letters were smeared from the inside of the wall, not painted on the surface, almost as if the message had seeped through the plaster. Lionel, her husband, tried to clean it. He scrubbed with vinegar, holy water. Even nothing worked. The name remained. And worse, the next day, another message appeared right beneath the first. "Let me out." This time, Marianne screamed. Lionel, ever the skeptical priest, began to lose his grip on reason. Every attempt to remove the writing failed. He even tried to repaint the wall, but the letters bled through, reappearing by evening gunshanked and defiant. Then came the stones. It was a quiet afternoon. Rain tapped gently against the windows as Marianne sat in the kitchen, trying to focus on her sewing. Her hands trembled. The silence was unsettling. Even the wind seemed to avoid this house now. Suddenly, without warning, the kitchen window shattered. A stone no larger than a chicken egg landed in the middle of the room. Marian gasped and ran to the broken glass, expecting to see children or neighbors playing a cruel trick. There was no one. Just the still, gray fog curling along the yard like fingers. Within minutes, another stone crashed through the parlor window, then another, and another. But the pattern was wrong. They weren't coming from outside. The angles were impossible. The stones were being thrown from within the house. That evening, Lionel called upon a local psychic, Miss Emma Bradshaw. She was known in the surrounding villages as someone who knew things. People whispered she spoke with the dead and once banished a ghost from a butcher shop. Emma stepped into Borley Rectory with caution, her palms pressed tightly together. "It's not just haunted," she said slowly, walking through the main hall. "It's inhabited." She stood before the wall where the messages had appeared, and after a moment of silence, turned pale. "There's a spirit trapped here. She's not angry, she's desperate." Marian whispered, "What does she want?" Emma answered without hesitation, "To be heard, to be freed. But she doesn't understand she's dead." That night, the psychic conducted a séance. 5 people sat around the large wooden dining table, the room lit only by candlelight. Marianne and Lionel were among them, along with Emma and a trusted villagers. Hands joined, eyes closed. Emma's voice was soft. "If you are here with us, give us a sign." A long silence. Then a loud bang echoed upstairs, followed by a crash. Then the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy, dragging, slow walking down the corridor above them. Emma's eyes fluttered open. "She's here." The candle flames twisted violently, bending sideways as if pulled by some unseen force. A chill swept the room. Lionel tried to stand, but couldn't move, his body frozen in place. Then, directly in front of them, a stone hovered in midair. It floated for a moment, trembling, before shooting across the room and smashing into a framed painting. No one spoke. Emma slowly raised her hand toward the space where the stone had floated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your name, say your name." The temperature dropped suddenly. Their breath became visible in the cold. And then, faint but unmistakable, from the hallway, a woman's voice. "N." That was the last word spoken during the séance. Later that night, the word "N" appeared on the same wall, just below the others. Marianne, terrified but determined to understand, began researching the history of Borley Rectory. What she found made her blood run cold. According to old church records, in the 1600s, there had been a young nun named Anne-Marie who had disappeared from a nearby convent. Rumors said she had fallen in love with a priest in unforgivable sin. The two had tried to escape together, planning to meet in secret along the old path where Borley Rectory would later be built, but Anne never arrived at the meeting spot. Her lover, heartbroken and eventually discovered, was sentenced to death, but Anne's body was never found. It was believed she had been buried alive within the convent's walls, punished in silence, her soul trapped in darkness. Marianne was convinced, and was the spirit, the ghost that wandered the halls, wrote messages in blood, and hurled stones in frustration. She wasn't evil, she was forgotten. As the days passed, the hauntings grew worse. Now the writings on the wall appeared in different languages: Latin, French, and once a dialect no one could identify. Stones didn't just float, they circled the room. Candles lit themselves. Bibles fell open to pages about punishment, love, and eternal imprisonment. The house was becoming unstable, as if the spirit's energy was reaching a boiling point. And then came the night of the final message. Marian woke at 3:17 a.m., heart racing. She heard humming, a soft, broken melody like a lullaby sung by someone weeping. It came from the hallway. She stepped out and saw it. The words, covering the wall from ceiling to floor. "I waited. He never came. I died in silence, and beneath it, written in a trembling hand, "Forgive me." Marianne fell to her knees. The next morning, they called for the church to perform a full exorcism. It took 3 priests, a week of prayer, and several sleepless nights. But finally, the walls fell quiet, the stones stopped flying, the writings faded, and for the first time in months, Borley Rectory was still. Emma returned for a final visit. She walked the halls, eyes closed, listening. "She's gone," she whispered. "She's finally gone." But as she turned to leave, a single stone rolled gently across the floor, and the faint sound of a woman's humming followed her all the way to the door. Even today, long after the house was destroyed by fire in 1939, people still say the land remembers. That on misty nights, if you walk near the ruins of Borley Rectory, you might hear the soft clink of stone against stone or see words briefly appear in the dew-covered grass, only to vanish before you can read them. They say some spirits never rest, not until someone finally listens. The night of weeping when every door burst open. It was nearly midnight. The Borley Rectory lay in near total silence, blanketed in an eerie calm. Outside, the wind barely stirred the trees, not even the owls hooted. Inside, Lionel and Marianne Foister sat in the sitting room, both uneasy. Something was off that night, they could feel it. The house was cold, colder than usual for autumn. The fireplace had long since died down, but the chill in the air felt deeper than that. It was the kind of cold that crept into the bones not from temperature, but from something else, something unseen. As the clock ticked toward 12, the couple decided to head to bed. But the moment Marianne stepped into the hallway, she froze. The air shifted. The floor beneath her feet trembled ever so slightly. Then came the sound, a low creaking noise like wood being forced apart. It came from every direction, first the east hallway, then the kitchen, then above them on the second floor. Lionel turned sharply toward the sound. "Did you hear that?" Before Marianne could respond, it happened. Bang! The door to the dining room flew open violently. Bang, bang. Next, the kitchen door, then the study, then the back door. One after another, every single door in the house burst open with a crash so loud it echoed through the walls like thunder. Within seconds, the entire rectory was a whirlwind of chaos. Doors slammed open on their hinges, some swinging wildly as if unseen hands were pushing them. Others banged into walls with such force that the plaster cracked. Then came the crying. Not just crying, but a wail, a scream of pure despair. It was feminine, high-pitched, drawn out in agony. It wasn't coming from one direction, it seemed to echo from all corners of the house. Marianne's face went pale. "That's the same cry I heard last week," she whispered, trembling. "In the hallway, remember?" Lionel didn't answer. He was staring down the dark corridor, frozen in place, his jaw clenched. The crying grew louder, and with it came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, bare feet slapping against the old wooden floors, running from room to room, but leaving no shadow behind. The couple stood rooted in place, terrified, as the footsteps ran past them. Then silence, total, oppressive silence. All the doors now hung open, as if the house itself had exhaled. But it wasn't over. From upstairs came the slow, dragging sound of something heavy being pulled across the floor. It groaned and screeched, like old furniture being moved by force. But there was no one up there, no reason for it to move. Lionel grabbed the oil lantern and slowly made his way to the staircase. "Don't go up there," Marianne pleaded, grabbing his arm. "Please, not tonight." But he was already climbing. Each step creaked louder than the last, and as he reached the top, the air became dense, thick, almost suffocating. At the end of the corridor, one of the bedroom doors slammed shut on its own. He rushed forward and threw it open. Nothing, except the crying had returned. Now it was behind him. He turned, expecting to see Mariana, but the hallway was empty. Still, the cries came closer. He could feel the vibration of the sound in his chest, like something screaming right next to his ear. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. And then, for the first time since they'd moved into Borley Rectory, he saw it. A figure, a translucent woman standing at the far end of the hallway, dressed in what looked like a dark cloak, her face completely obscured by shadow, but her outline shimmered with a faint, ghostly glow. She wasn't walking, she was gliding, slowly, deliberately, toward him. He couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. She raised one hand, as if to reach out, but before she could, every candle in the house blew out. Darkness, and just like that she was gone. Lionel stumbled back down the stairs, almost tripping over himself. Marianne was waiting at the bottom, eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" she demanded. The second saw her, he whispered, out of breath. "She was there. A woman. She was coming toward me." Marianne stared at him in shock. This wasn't like Lionel. He had always been the skeptic, the calm, the rational one. But his face was ghost white, and his hands were trembling. The rest of the night passed in silence. They didn't sleep. They couldn't. The following morning, they tried to explain it all away. The wind, old hinges, maybe a draft, maybe their minds playing tricks. But neither really believed that, because when they examined the upstairs hallway, they saw it. A set of wet, barefoot prints, trailing all the way to the spot where Lionel had seen the woman and vanishing into nothing. The legend grows. Over the following days, word of the event spread. Locals who had always been suspicious of the house now whispered about the night the doors opened. Some claimed they'd seen strange lights flickering in the windows that night. Others said they'd heard the wailing from as far as the village. And for the Foysters, it only got worse. The weeping sounds returned frequently, now sometimes in the middle of the day. Doors slammed themselves shut with such force they'd splinter. Dishes flew from cabinets. Crucifixes fell from walls. Once when Lionel tried to conduct a private prayer session in the chapel room, a gust of freezing wind blew in and extinguished every candle despite the windows being shut tight. It wasn't just haunting. It was hostile. But who was she? Paranormal investigators suggested it could be the spirit of the nunth. One said to have been bricked up alive centuries ago for breaking her vows. Others believed it was something else entirely. A tormented soul who had once lived there, or perhaps died there. Some even whispered the term intelligent, haunting the idea that the presence in Borley Rectory wasn't just lingering energy, but aware, watching, reacting, even responding to the living. The door event, a special lithy way it happened at the exact stroke of midnight. All at once suggested something deliberate, coordinated. Was it a warning? Was the spirit trying to communicate? Or was it just trying to terrify? The Foysters didn't have an answer, but they started keeping a journal of every incident, dates, times, what they saw, what they heard. And one night, they noticed something terrifying. Every major incident, every physical manifestation was happening on the same date each month. The 28th, the final note of the chapter. On the next 28th, they decided to prepare. They brought in a local reverend, placed protective crosses in each room, and lit candles in every hallway. When midnight came, they stood together in the living room, hands clenched. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, crash! Every window in the house shattered inward, as if struck from the outside. The sound was deafening, and in the shards of glass that rained down like icy rain, they saw it. A faint figure reflected in the glass before it hit the floor. Always the same. The woman. And always, always crying. The Borley Rectory wasn't just haunted. It was crying out. And no one knew what would happen next. The secret behind the old fireplace, the remaining bones. For years, the old fireplace in Borley Rectory had stood untouched, sealed off behind layers of brick and soot. Like a scar from a forgotten era. No one questioned it. It was simply part of the house's decaying anatomy. But when Harry Price returned once more in early autumn of 1938, something about that fireplace began to gnaw at his curiosity. He had always believed the house was more than just a place of hauntings. It was a tomb of secrets. And that fireplace, oddly positioned and walled up without explanation, felt like it had something to hide. On a crisp October morning, Price gathered his team 12 assistants and a local mason. With tools in hand and the light streaming through the dusty windows, they began to carefully remove the bricks covering the fireplace. The process was slow, deliberate. Each brick pried away felt like uncovering a layer of the house's soul. As the final layer of mortar gave way, the smell hit them, first damp, earthy, and disturbingly sweet. Then, the cavity revealed itself. A hollow darkness stretched inside the fireplace where something had once burned. But it was not just ashes they found. Price shone his torch into the space. A small pile of bones lay nestled in the far corner, half buried under crumbling debris. The bones were clearly human, fragile and yellowed with time. But most chilling of all was what lay beside them, fragments of a habit, dark cloth, tattered, but unmistakably from a nun's garment. The room fell into a heavy silence. No one spoke. Even the house seemed to still, as if holding its breath. The discovery ignited a media frenzy, but Price kept the true details quiet. He suspected no. He knew this was the key to the nun's restless spirit that had been seen wandering the grounds. For decades, witnesses had often described a sorrowful woman in a black veil gliding silently through the garden, or staring from the windows. Some claimed to hear soft weeping or prayers in Latin coming from the chapel that no longer stood. But who was she? Digging deeper into the church records and forbidden tales, Price uncovered a chilling story buried by time and shame. In the mid-17th century, during a period of intense religious persecution, a young nun from a nearby French convent had fled with her Lovera priest. They had hoped to escape and start a new life in England. But when they arrived at Borley, they were caught. The priest was reportedly executed by his own order. The nun, however, was never seen again. Until now, there were whispers unofficial and never recorded that she had been walled up alive. As penance for her sins, some said it was done by those who believed her soul needed to be trapped and punished for eternity. Whether this was superstition or a cruel act of fanaticism, the evidence now lay at Price's feet. The skeletal remains of a woman hidden inside a fireplace, never meant to be used. That night, Harry Price sat alone in the drawing room, the fire newly lit but eerily dim. The rest of the team had retired early, disturbed by the day's events. Rain tapped against the window panes, and wind moaned through the cracked beams above. Then came the sound. At first, it was soft like whispering. He leaned forward, heart pounding, trying to distinguish the words. They weren't in English. Latin. Faint, rhythmic, and sorrowful. Price grabbed his notebook, scribbling down the phrases as best he could. One line repeated over and over, Libera me, Domini, de morte eterna. Deliver me, O Lord, from eternal death. The prayer of the dead. Suddenly, the flames in the fireplace surged, flaring as if fed by an unseen force. The temperature in the room plummeted. His breath fogged in front of him. Then the whispering stopped. A single loud knock echoed from inside the fireplace. Not on the wall, not from the chimney. From inside the bricked-up cavity they had just opened that morning. Harry stood frozen. The knock came again, 3 slow raps, and then silence. The next day, Price contacted the local diocese. The remains were taken to consecrated ground and buried with proper rites. A quiet ceremony, barely attended. No name could be placed on the gravestone. She had none. But that wasn't the end. For days after the burial, the house was quiet, peaceful even. The cold spots disappeared. The crying at night ceased. The floating objects stopped. Until the 5th night. One of the assistants, James, was alone in the study cataloging notes. Just after midnight, he heard soft footsteps pacing upstairs. He assumed it was Price and called out. No response. Then came the weeping. A woman's voice, mournful, heartbreaking. James rushed up the stairs, flashlight in hand. The hallway was empty, but down at the far end, near the old fireplace, he saw her, just for a second. A pale woman in black, her face hidden by a veil, her hands clasped in prayer. She turned slowly, as if to look at him, then vanished. Terrified, James fled the house, refusing to return. Word spread quickly. Despite the burial, the spirit remained. Or perhaps it wasn't just her. Price began to suspect that something far more ancient, far more malicious, was tied to the land beneath Borley Rectory. The nun may have been a victim but not the source. What if the very ground had been cursed long before the house was ever built? In old maps and folklore, Price found references to a pagan site once existing near that exact location, a place where rituals were performed under moonlight, long before Christianity came to the region. Could her punishment have trapped her not just in death, but in a vortex of spiritual torment, fueled by centuries of dark belief? More and more, the activity escalated. Doors slammed shut. Crucifixes fell from the walls. Visitors fainted upon entering the drawing room. One woman claimed her hair was pulled violently while she sat in silence. A local psychic who visited refused to enter the hallway, stating, "There's a presence here that does not forgive." Something older than the church, older than God. Price continued his investigations, torn between logic and terror. He documented everything, trying to remain neutral, scientific. But deep down he knew this was not just a haunting. It was a cry for justice, a wound left open too long, a forgotten story finally screaming to be heard. And the old fireplace, now exposed, remained cold. No matter how many fires they lit within it, the flames never gave warmth. It was as if the very stones had absorbed centuries of sorrow, and now they wept from within. The mysterious fire of 1936, flames of vengeance. The year was 1936. Borley Rectory, once called the most haunted house in England, had already been abandoned. The whispers about its dark secrets, ghostly nuns, disembodied voices, and doors that opened on their own had long turned from rumors into legends. But just when people thought the worst was behind them, Borley caught fire. And it wasn't just any fire. It was an inferno-raging, uncontrollable, and unexplainable. Many believed it was the final act of a soul who had waited too long for justice. A soul who no longer wanted to haunt. A soul who wanted revenge. It started on a chilly evening in February. The rectory, by then empty and mostly used for storage by the new owner, Captain Gregson, had become a forgotten structure to most of the village. The thick vines curling up its bricks, the boarded windows, and the smell of dampness made it look more like a tomb than a home. Captain Gregson, a retired military man who had taken over the property with plans to renovate it, was in the back garden, when he noticed a thin column of smoke drifting from the rectory roof. He rushed inside. The air inside was still and cold until he reached the hallway. That's when he saw it. Flames were already licking the staircase. But what stunned him more was how fast the fire was spreading, as if the house itself had been soaked in fuel. Gregson tried calling for help, but the nearest phone was a mile away. By the time he reached the villagers, the house was already engulfed. What puzzled the fire brigade later was that there had been no working gas lines, no electric faults, no stored combustibles inside anything that could explain the intensity or origin of the fire. Yet the walls burned like dry paper, and the flames seemed to pour out of the very floorboards. Witnesses described something even more unsettling. "I swear I saw a woman standing inside the upstairs window," said Martha Eddington, a local who had arrived to help. "She was in an old-fashioned habit, like a nun. She wasn't screaming. She was just staring, like she wanted us to watch." Other villagers reported hearing Creasum, said they were screams of agony. Others said it sounded like chanting. One elderly man, Thomas Greaves, whispered, "It wasn't a fire, it was punishment. Someone in there had waited long enough." In the days that followed, investigators combed through the blackened ruins. The structure was beyond repair. The famous haunted house of Borley was no more. But the mystery had only deepened. Among the charred rubble, a section of brickwork near the old dining room had collapsed, revealing something no one had noticed before. Behind the wall was a narrow, bricked-up corridor. At the end of it, a small iron gate. And behind that gate, ashes, bone fragments, and something else. A melted crucifix. Experts confirmed the remains were human. The bones were too degraded to provide much detail, but enough survived to show they belonged to a small adult female. Close to the bones, they found rusted links, perhaps part of a chain or shackles. Some believed this was the final resting place of the nun, whose spirit had been seen wandering Borley for years, trapped behind brick and iron, buried to live or worse. The story, once thought to be local folklore, suddenly felt terrifyingly real. So what caused the fire? Some tried to explain it with science, suggesting perhaps spontaneous combustion from old materials, or a chemical reaction from forgotten substances. But the house had been searched multiple times in the past, and nothing dangerous had ever been recorded. Others pointed to the spiritual. Reverend Foister, one of the rectory's former residents, had written about the oppressive presence in the house. He claimed to have witnessed objects flying, words appearing on mirrors, and whispers echoing in empty rooms. His wife had nearly lost her sanity living there. And of course, there was Harry Priceth, famous paranormal investigator who had spent years studying Borley. He had long suspected the presence of a wronged spirit, perhaps a nun from the 17th century, who had died tragically within the walls. In one of Price's notes, found after the fire, he had written, "I fear the house is not merely haunted, it is cursed. The walls hold a memory of suffering that refuses to fade. I believe something terrible happened here, something covered up, and if the house should one day fall, I do not believe it will be by accident." That line would later be repeated in many books, documentaries, and television specials about the haunting. Some say the nun's ghost had finally grown strong enough to set the house ablaze, destroy the place of her torment. Others say she was warning the living that some places are not meant to be touched, disturbed, or remodeled. Captain Gregson never rebuilt. After the fire, he reportedly suffered from night terrors, screaming about a face in the smoke and a voice that called his name. He moved away the following year and refused to ever speak of Borley again. Today, the site where Borley Rectory once stood is an overgrown patch of grass and brick. But even now, locals avoid walking across it after dark. And every year, on the anniversary of the fire, some say you can still see smoke rising from the ground even when there's no wind and no heat, and nothing left to burn. Was it a tragedy, an accident, or was it the final chapter in a long story of betrayal and vengeance? Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: the fire didn't erase the legend of Borley. It made it eternal. After the ashes who found the nuns' remains, the fire at Borley Rectory in 1936 had turned the once feared manor into a smoldering skeleton. Thick, acrid smoke lingered in the surrounding trees for days, and the scent of scorched wood clung to every stone. Locals, both terrified and curious, gathered outside the charred ruins. They whispered among themselves, did she finally get her revenge? When the fire crews finished their grim work, they found something no one expected, or perhaps everyone feared. It started with a man named Thomas Runcie, a local laborer hired to clear the debris. He had no interest in ghost stories. In fact, he had scoffed at the tales of the phantom nun ever since he was a child. But that morning, as he sifted through the blackened rubble of what had once been the library, his spade struck something solid. Not stone, not metal, something brittle. It was a human bone. At first, Thomas assumed it was an animal, perhaps a dog or a fox caught in the fire. But as more pieces emerged from the ash, the truth became harder to ignore. A rib cage, a skull with hollow sockets still intact. But what disturbed him most, what sent him running from the ruins, without even collecting his pay, were the wrists. They were bound. Rusted iron cuffs clung tightly to the bones. The chains melted into the floor beneath. And nearby, fragments of scorched cloth, a coarse, dark habit, like that of a medieval nun, were tangled among the remains. News of the discovery spread fast. By the next morning, journalists, investigators, and local priests had descended upon the site. Among them was Father Edward Callahan, a Catholic priest and historian who had long studied the whispers of the Borley nun. He arrived with old manuscripts in hand, referencing a time long before the rectory stood. In the 14th century, Father Callahan explained to the gathered press, a Benedictine monastery stood not far from here, and according to suppressed church records, a young French nun fell in love with a monk from the order. Their affair was forbidden. When it was discovered, the monk disappeared, possibly fled, but the nun, he paused, lowering his voice, was walled up alive beneath the grounds, a ritual execution meant to purge her sin. The journalists went silent. Even the most skeptical among them couldn't hide their unease. The fire had unearthed not only bones but history, a cruel, unjust one. But the story didn't end there. A forensic analysis confirmed that the skeleton was female, likely in her mid-20s at the time of death. Her wrists had indeed been bound prior to death, and the scorch marks on the surrounding stone suggested she had been buried or imprisoned beneath the rectory's floor. Somehow, the flames of 1936 had freed her. More disturbingly, Father Callahan pointed out that the location where the bones were found matched the area behind the old hearthstone, a spot long rumored to be cursed. Previous residents of Borley Rectory had reported strange smells, sudden cold drafts, and whispers near that very wall. For years, Harry Price and others had theorized that the spirit of the nun was trapezoidal to move on, due to the violent way she died. And now, with her remains uncovered, perhaps something had been released, or something had awoken. A week after the bones were sent to the coroner's office, strange events resumed despite the house being nothing more than a burnt shell. Night 1. Two guards hired to watch the site claimed to hear soft, rhythmic chanting. They believed someone had snuck in. But when they investigated, the sounds vanished. No footprints, No signs of intrusion. Night 3, a journalist who camped near the site for a ghost hunting article fled in the early hours, claiming to have seen a figure in black drifting through the remains, her feet never touching the ground. He described her face as blank, as though she wore a mask of grief. Night 7, Father Callahan himself returned for a private prayer. He knelt in the ashes, offering peace to the soul of the woman whose life ended in agony. But as he recited the final Latin rites, a gust of wind unlike anything natural extinguished his candle. His recorder, left beside him, captured a soft female whisper, "Perdona-me, forgive me." Locals began to say the fire hadn't just uncovered the nun's remains, it had stirred her wrath. Some believed she had been waiting, trapped beneath centuries of stone and silence, for someone to find her. Others whispered that the fire was her doing a final act of vengeance against the house that imprisoned her. The church, uncomfortable with the attention, quietly ordered a proper burial for the bones. She was laid to rest in a small cemetery near a ruined chapel once belonging to the old monastery. No name marked her grave, only a stone cross and a single inscription in Latin. Requiescat in pace, anima vexata. May you rest in peace, tormented soul. But peace did not come. The nights grew restless. Farmers living nearby complained of livestock acting strangely, refusing to eat, panicking at unseen figures. A young girl claimed to see a sad lady in black staring at her from the tree line. Her parents moved away shortly after. And then there were the dreams. Several people who visited the site, journalists, clergy, even tourists, reported the same recurring nightmare. In it, they were trapped in a narrow stone room, unable to move, while a woman cried softly in the dark. Her voice would rise in desperation, begging for help, begging to be remembered. But just before they awoke, she would scream not out of anger, but heartbreak. Father Callahan, haunted by these dreams, later admitted that he feared they were more than mere imagination. "I believe we opened something," he said quietly to a colleague. "Not just her grave." A wound. As years passed, the stories faded into the background noise of English folklore. The site of Borley Rectory was eventually cleared, and nature slowly reclaimed the land. Trees grew over the foundations. Grass covered the last scorched stones. But those who knew, those who saw the remains, heard the whispers never truly forgot. Because beneath the soil, history still breathes, and not all souls rest, even in consecrated ground. Some say that on the anniversary of the fire, if you stand quietly in the fields where Borley Rectory once stood, you might hear faint weeping. Others claim that just before dawn, a soft glow appears among the ruins, the shape of a woman, hands folded in prayer, drifting through the fog. No one dares approach her, not anymore, because now they know what lies beneath, and they remember. The nun did not seek revenge. She sought release, but in her release the pain returned to the world, and the echoes of her final breath still linger, carried by the wind over Borley, whispering through the ashes, waiting for the next curious soul to listen. The house is gone, but the curse remains. They said the Borley Rectory burned to the ground, that the haunting would end with the last beam of charred wood collapsing into ash, that whatever spirits once walked its crooked hallways were buried beneath soot and silence. They were wrong. The house may be gone, but the land remembers. Every night since the fire in 1939, locals whisper of a pale figure seen drifting along the edge of the old rectory grounds. No structure stands there anymore, just overgrown weeds and blackened soil. But still, at midnight, the air becomes unnaturally cold. Animals refuse to cross the lot, and those brave or foolish enough to visit at night report the same thing. A faint sound of footsteps across gravel, and a whispering voice calling from nowhere. Always female, always mournful. The Borley curse, it seems, did not die with the house. The priest who wouldn't leave. It began again with Father Michael Elwood, a retired Anglican priest, who moved into the village in 1952. Despite warnings from townsfolk, he built a small cottage less than 50 meters from the ruins of the old rectory. He said he didn't believe in ghosts. He said he believed in God. He lasted 3 weeks. The priest first reported strange knocking at his door, always 3 taps, always between 2 and 3 a.m. One night, he opened the door expecting a drunk or prankster. No one stood outside, but the sound of heavy breathing remained, as if something were just beyond the frame, watching. He spoke of books falling from shelves, candles lighting themselves, and once, most chillingly, the clear imprint of a woman's face on the window pane, from the inside of the house. But it was the dreams that truly broke him. In his journal, later found by local police after he fled the property, he wrote, "She walks without legs. Her dress floats as if underwater. Her hands are bound, and she screams not aloud, but in my mind. She begs me to dig. Dig where? The unearthed ring." In 1963, nearly 25 years after the fire, 2 teenagers dared each other to spend the night near the site, armed with nothing more than a flashlight, a tin of biscuits, and adolescent bravado. They camped near what used to be the cellar. At precisely 1:45 a.m., the younger of the 2, Jamie Lorne, heard what he described as a low, humming chant as if a nun were praying in Latin. His flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into complete darkness. Then came the smell, a rotting, sweet stench like burned flowers mixed with decay. They didn't wait for dawn. They ran and never returned. But one of them, years later, during a renovation of the village churchyard, accidentally unearthed something curious, a small silver ring, blackened by fire. Etched inside was a Latin phrase, non expectata sum, I was not expected. Tests dated the ring to the 14th century, but no explanation was given as to why it was buried deep in soil nowhere near a documented grave. The curse continues. Despite the destruction of the house, phenomena persisted. In 1974, a psychic named Evelyn Darrow visited Borley with a documentary crew. She claimed to receive direct messages from the nun thought to be the same ghost, repeatedly cited since the 1800s. According to her, the nun's name was Sister Annalise, and she had been walled alive behind the rectory during a scandalous affair with a monk. Centuries prior, the story matched earlier reports from spiritualist Harry Price, though historians insisted no such records existed in church archives. Evelyn collapsed during the session. She was found foaming at the mouth, murmuring Latin phrases in reverse. For weeks after, she was haunted by shadowy figures in her dreams. She later admitted to carving strange symbols into her own arms to keep the others out. She never returned to Borley, but the activity didn't stop. The mirror ritual. By the early 1980s, urban legends grew around the Borley site. One such legend involved a broken mirror salvaged from the fire. It was said to be cursed. Any who looked into it at midnight would not see their own reflection, but the face of the nun, her mouth sewn shut. The mirror was kept in a local museum for a time, but removed after 3 staff members claimed to suffer episodes of dissociation while cleaning near it. One even tried to gouge out her eyes, after claiming she saw herself die over and over in the reflection. Today, that mirror is sealed in storage in an undisclosed location. The last photograph. In 1997, a Canadian photographer named Samuel Trelawney visited Borley for a travel project about haunted lands of Europe. He brought state-of-the-art equipment, staying 3 nights on the site with full permission from local authorities. He captured dozens of photographs, most of which showed nothing unusual, except one, taken at 12:13 a.m. on his second night. The image clearly shows the faint outline of a woman floating above the scorched earth, where the rectory once stood. Her arms are stretched outward, wrists twisted unnaturally. Her face, though blurred, bears to black pits where eyes should be. Experts confirmed the image had not been doctored. No lens flare, no double exposure. Samuel never published the photo. He died 6 months later in a car crash swerving off the road in broad daylight, reportedly after seeing a woman in a long veil step in front of his car. The woman was never found. A curse without end. Locals today still refuse to walk past the lot after nightfall. Many claim their dogs growl or whimper when near it. The village council has tried to convert the land first into a park, then a memorial, then a private property listing. All attempts failed. One developer fell seriously ill after visiting the site. Another went missing entirely. Last seen walking the edge of the land with blueprints in hand. His car was found abandoned. His boots were discovered near the tree line, facing the old foundation. He was never recovered. To this day, nothing has been built on the land. And every year, on the anniversary of the fire, February 27th, villagers report hearing faint chanting in the wind, as if 1,000 prayers are being whispered through the branches. Who was she, truly? No one knows the nun's real identity. Some believe she was a scapegoat in a greater conspiracy, a woman wronged by the church, erased from the records, punished and buried alive. Others think she was no nun at all, but something else, pretending to be holy, feeding off the tragedies that occurred within the rectory walls. What we do know is this: the Borley Rectory may have burned, but the energy, the horror remains. It clings to the soil. It seeps into the dreams of the living. Ghosts don't need walls to haunt. They only need memory and pain. And at Borley, there is still so much pain. So if you ever find yourself wandering the Essex countryside and stumble upon a plot of land where nothing grows, where even the birds fall silent, and where the wind carries prayers you can't quite understand, turn around and don't look back. The curse is not finished. Not yet. The last night at Borley, the curse never left. Even after the fire reduced the infamous Borley Rectory to ash and rubble, something remained, something that refused to burn. The villagers of Borley no longer dared to walk near the site after nightfall, not because of the memories, but because of what they still saw. A flickering light in the darkness, footsteps on gravel where there was no path, a cloaked figure gliding silently across the charred foundation to vanish. Before one could blink, the house was gone. But the curse, it seemed, had survived. In the days that followed the blaze, a quiet tension blanketed the village. Animals refused to graze near the old rectory grounds. Children had nightmares of faceless women weeping beneath dead trees. Even the wind seemed to carry whispers, incomprehensible but heavy with sorrow. Local historian Malcolm Greaves, who had documented every known haunting in East Anglia, couldn't stay away. He believed there was one last story the rectory had yet to tell. It doesn't matter if the house is gone, Malcolm told his assistant, Elise, one rainy morning. The land remembers. That's where the real haunting lies. Elise wasn't convinced. You think it's tied to the ground? Not just the ground, he said. The act, the injustice, the pain, all of it is burned into this place. That evening, Malcolm and Elise set up their equipment: motion sensors, audio recorders, thermal cameras in the overgrown lot. Nothing remained of the rectory except a portion of the stone foundation and a crumbling well. Midnight came quickly. The silence was almost unnatural. No owls, no wind, just stillness. Then, at exactly 12:13 a.m., the temperature plummeted. Their thermal camera picked up a form small, thin, kneeling on the edge of the ruins. "It's the nun," Elise whispered. Malcolm nodded, watching the monitor in disbelief. The outline was unmistakable. A woman in robes, hands bound in front of her, head bowed, and then she raised her face. There were no features, no eyes, no mouth, just a void where a face should be. Elise screamed. The figure vanished, but the equipmentary device they had continued recording a sound. Chanting, soft, breathy Latin phrases, a desperate voice, looping in fragments. "Libera me, Domini ex morte eterna." Malcolm recognized the line was from a funeral mass. "Deliver me, O Lord, from eternal death." The next morning, Elise refused to return, but Malcolm couldn't stay away. Over the next week, he uncovered something buried deep beneath years of old records and rumor. A sealed court transcript from 1367. It told the story of a young nun from a nearby convent, executed for a forbidden love affair with a priest. The trial had been conducted in secret. No official records, no burial. Her name had been erased from all history, but the details match down to the exact location of the rectory grounds, which had once belonged to the church. She had been buried alive, a punishment for her sin. Malcolm believed the haunting was more than a ghost story. It was an echo of injustice, a soul trapped in its final moment. Driven by obsession, he returned to the site one final night. He brought nothing but a small cross, a shovel, and the Latin rites used to bless the dead. The night was still, as always. As he dug near the well, the earth seemed to resist him, thick with roots and ancient bones. After 2 hours, his shovel hit stone. A small wooden box, blackened by time, rested beneath the soil. He opened it. Inside was a rosary and a fragment of cloth monastic, simple, preserved far beyond reason. And then footsteps. He looked up. The nun stood at the edge of the pit, hands no longer bound, her face still empty, but somehow peaceful. Malcolm dropped to his knees and began the rites. Requiem aeternam dona Domini. As he spoke, the wind picked up, swirling ash and leaves into the air. The ground trembled beneath him, not violently but as if exhaling. When he finished the final prayer, the figure nodded once, and then she was gone. No screams, no lights, just a profound silence. The next morning, villagers found Malcolm asleep near the well, mud-streaked and pale, but smiling. He never published what he saw, but he did leave behind a notebook. In it, he wrote, "The curse was not the haunting. The curse was forgetting." She wanted someone to remember her truth, not her crime, not her ghost, just her name. We buried her story with stone and fire, but she endured, waiting for someone who would see beyond the fear. Today, nothing remains of Borley Rectory but the grass and silence. Yet travelers still visit. They don't find ghosts, not anymore, but they do find a small stone marker, placed carefully by Malcolm's own hand. It reads, "Here lies Sister Eleanor, loved, forgotten, freed." The villagers no longer whisper of curses, but every year, on the same night the rectory burned, someone lights a candle at the stone. No one knows who. No one claims to see anything. But sometimes, just as the candle flickers out, a soft breeze carries a single line through the quiet. "Libera me, Domini," and the wind moves on.